Is it moving?
I haven't got a notification if it's recording, isn't it? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
You can share the screen now.
Yeah. Thanks very much for having us.
Yeah.
I'm just going to share the screen. Hopefully you can see that. Quickly turn the audio on because we've got a couple of videos in here to show you as well, and hopefully they kind of hold up and the quality isn't too bad, but we'll just go through kind of get started on this. I think this is a little bit of a kind of like a halfway point for us, this lecture, because it's based on our research, some of the research that we're doing at the moment. So we'll go into that in a little bit of detail, but kind of, I guess there might be a bit some questions for you to ask at the end.
Yeah, so I think it's a lecture with hopefully a lot of questions. We have we're carrying out some research together and presenting a paper at a conference in May, and so this lecture is kind of a way for us to gather some of the thoughts we've had and maybe ask for some direction from the audience, really, to see if they if you have any pointers.
We've kind of shifted this lecture a little bit to sort of promote collaboration. I think it's just a really important thing, and like interdisciplinary work or multidisciplinary work, I guess, whichever way you want to define that. Because right now, I guess with the current kind of creative climate and sort of the situation we all find ourselves in, that is, we're finding very, very important for us to remain inspired and look at things in new ways.
Talk to other people, and
so that's one of the agendas in today.
So we're looking at how cross-disciplinary work can reveal new tools and perspectives on our own disciplines, and how it can sometimes offer, at the very least, offer inspiration when we're feeling creatively stuck. And I was telling Jake the other day that I read about how Kenzo Kuma, who is a famous architect, who hopefully the architecture students know, he's often inspired by the work of the floral artist Daniel Aust. And in this particular quote, he was saying that Daniel Aust's work quite often inspires him to quit architecture and start a new practice which transcends categorization.
There are some obvious parallels between architecture and game design. Most prominently, both design environments, and these environments are designed for other people to inhabit and interpret how they wish. But what is interesting to us is what the differences are between the disciplines, and if given the similarities, could these differences be usefully applied across the disciplines?
So, as we said already, we're reasonably early days in our research into how game design, and particularly narrative in game design, can be used for our real world urban design. But we're starting from the position that historically built environments are not designed diversely. And could video games give us potential solutions to solve that problem? And we're looking at diversity as being the variety of accessible narratives that are available in the built environment.
Many academics acknowledge there are three main ways that the narrative comes into play in the urban realm. One is narratives for planning, so the history of the place pre-existing, narrative of location, and community stories passed on verbally, for example. And these narratives can be farmed for information for the planning/design process.
And then you've got narratives in planning, which is the architect as sign maker, the semiotics of a city that can be read through signs. And you have also in this category planners who are making decisions based on rhetoric, so the narrative of who tells the best story, the the best story means you're building wins, planning permission.
So, and then you have narratives of planning. So after something has been made, what stories are being told, community, media, industry, these sorts of things. At every stage, you want these stories to be as wide and as diverse as possible, right? And you want as many people engaging in them as possible. This will ensure the urban design better reflects the people that live in it.
And we think that the advantages that games have over architecture is that they're excellent vehicles for storytelling. This is because in a lot of cases you're encouraged to be curious and learn and connect with the environment. We'd say not all games tell good stories or diverse stories, but they're very good vehicles for storytelling.
There are a lot of stories in the built environment, yet they are not often accessible, right? So storytelling in games is initially interesting to us because it, one, uses the environment to tell the story, and we're going to give some case studies to explain this, which will be the bulk of the lecture. Two, the interactive nature encourages greater complexity of play, complexity of and play with non-linear storytelling. And three, engages and empowers players by using curiosity and uncertainty. So without, I guess, further exposition, let's kind of get into it with some case studies.
Look at some games. Much more interesting than architecture. So our first case study is Outer Wilds, which was released in 2019 by Mobius Digital and published by Annapurna Interactive. Outer Wilds is an action-adventure puzzle game where you have to figure out how to save the universe before its inevitable explosion due to take place every 22 minutes.
Praised for its emergent narrative, Outer Wilds forces the player to find not just a solution and the path to the game's conclusion, but the purpose of play. The Groundhog Day inspired mechanic at the center of the game, returning to the same point at the presumed start of the same day every time you die, positions Outer Wilds firmly in the modernist ideology of the scientific method, where doubt is used as a tool to come to a conclusion, i.e., if you think you know something, try to disprove it so you can know it better. Every test or hypothesis that your idea passes, the more valuable the idea becomes.
Every time you loop, the test is reset, maintaining all the information you've gathered. So you go back to the beginning of the day, but you don't forget that information that you've gathered. And this is Outer Wilds systemizing the scientific method into gameplay, ensuring iteration and exploration are important to the meaning of play. This systematic approach to gameplay allows us to repeatedly engage with and develop our relationship with the environment. The game environment is the laboratory in which the player experiments.
Every piece of information is learned from the world around you. With every playthrough, you must build on previous narratives learned from your interactions with the environment. You use what you have learned to make changes and to solve problems. To reinforce this narrative, you begin the game completely unknowing.
So the first time in the game, when you first wake up, you're completely unaware and unfamiliar with everything. So once you get on your ship and out into space, you're invited to engage with the environment, to question and learn. You learn the story, who the people are, what the culture is, what the physics of this world is, how time passes, what things are threats to you, what things are sacred to you, and also the reasons of why and why you're playing and how to play. These are all discovered, and as part of this discovery, there's this constant questioning, and you're questioning the environment, and the answers come from the environment. You scientifically and methodically gather all this information for a reason, and that is also discovered through the environment. And this is what is known as an emergent narrative. And emergent narrative is very different to a plot-driven linear narrative.
In his seminal piece, Game Design as Narrative Architecture, Henry Jenkins observes that game designers don't simply tell stories. They design worlds and sculpt spaces, which hopefully should sound a bit familiar to the audience, where the structuring of game spaces facilitates different kinds of narrative experiences. Emergent narrative is one of these experiences, where resources within the environment are used as essentially storytelling components, thus inviting the player to explore and be inquisitive in this space.
This exploration of the environment for storytelling purposes benefits from allowing the player to take ownership of the narrative. One review of the game Outer Wilds by the journalist Ewan Moore suggests that the real joy of Outer Wilds is the journey, and not so much what you discover, but how you discover it. What he means here is that the game doesn't explicitly tell you anything. The information is built into the environment, which, as already said, you must rigorously test. Sorry.
In Outer Wilds, it is less a case of right and wrong, right, to solve the mystery, and more a case of which way have you pieced it together. The experience of authorship tends towards non-competitive gameplay, which is essential in this case, as Outer Wilds' relationship with failure or defeat is far more complicated and rewarding, replacing all feeling of punishment or loss with intrigue and learning. The looping mechanic at the heart of the gameplay is the invitation to return to the environment to have another look, encouraging us to constantly play and communicate with our surroundings.
This relationship the player has built with the environment in games, and the open invitation to explore and question and learn things, learn from the things around us, is very special. I think perhaps something unique to games. We can see that this practice of invitation is most, but in addition to this, this special quality of questioning, we can see that it depends on, its success depends on uncertainty and curiosity being designed into the experience.
The theories on curiosity suggest that people have varying preferences for tolerance of uncertainty. So put simply, uncertainty is an information gap, and curiosity is the desire to fill that gap. Baseline tolerances of uncertainty are then complicated by abilities to tolerate emotional discomfort, confidence in your ability to resolve the uncertainty, and familiarity with the domain in which you are uncertain, right? So those are kind of the qualifiers of this.
Yeah, I was really surprised doing this reading, because I thought I was always very curious and liked curiosity, but I think what I've realized is I have an extreme intolerance to curiosity and like have to fill in the information gaps. But the reading, the academics suggest that there's 5 different types of curiosity. So the first one being perceptual curiosity, which is increased attention to novel stimuli. The second being manipulatory curiosity, which is a feeling experienced while encountering a manually explorable object. Then curiosity about the complex or ambiguous, so having a preference for interacting with more intricate stimuli. Conceptual curiosity, which I think is my favorite curiosity, which is information seeking about concepts behind things. And then the final one, which is adjustive reactive curiosity, which is how people explore novel environments.
So in our work, we are particularly interested in how people can be more perceptually curious about their built environment, i.e. questioning why the environment looks as it does. However, all these curious or types of curiosity, are employed in game design and can be used to get players to engage in their environment in a myriad of ways. One thought-provoking example that best demonstrates this is a personal favourite of mine, Return of the Obra Dinn, a game that uses information gaps as a primary gameplay mechanic.
So this game was created by one-man band Lucas Pope, which it's kind of amazing. I think it took him 4 years to make all by himself. It must have been working flat out on it. But the game is the game is an insurance adventure detective game. So the player assumes the role of an insurance inspector who is investigating a claim made on a merchant ship that has mysteriously reappeared off the coast of England 5 years after it went missing. The crew of the Obra Dinn are all missing, presumed dead, and the only thing aboard the ship are several skeletons and some abandoned cargo. Armed with a magical pocket watch and a roster of all 60 crew and passengers, 2 drawings that feature the faces of all the members of the ship, and a journal, you as the player have to reconstruct the events of the voyage and turn the uncertain fates of those aboard into a certain conclusion.
The main gameplay loop of Obra Dinn is enabled by the magic pocket watch, the Memento Mortem, a device that, when used on various corpses you discover, allows you to revisit the moment of the death, frozen in time. Before you get to that freeze frame, which is probably better described as a diorama, you are given a sound clip of a few seconds leading up to the death. Now, we've got a clip for you to to show you, to explain this probably a little better than we can.
Fingers crossed this works.
Captain! Open the door! Kick it in. Lest we break it down and take more than those shells!
You bastards may take exactly what I give you!
Okay. This isn't any spoilers, though. We should probably say that at the beginning.
Yeah.
This is the very first memory that you get. So if anybody who's really curious and wants to play this, there's not spoilers here. This is maybe a little bit, but not huge ones.
The word of warning: if you have any deadlines, probably don't play it because you'll be stuck there for
sucked in.
Yeah.
Here we begin to observe the vast sea of uncertainty, right? So to get back to the point, at the center of this experience, and how it is designed to allow the player to maintain confidence in their ability to fill in the information, a vital catalyst in the process of turning uncertainty into curiosity.
In this particular scene that we just watched, we know that the man with the gun is the captain. The man being shot is Scottish, and that's about it. So who is this Scottish man? Who are the people around him? Why did the captain shoot him? What is the sequence of events that have led to this stage? Our uncertainty begins to give way to curiosity. However, we need more information.
In the this is another clip for you to
Abigail,
explain.
Your brother, my friend, I shot him dead. I'll be with you soon, my love. Please forgive me for everything.
So now we're equipped with the knowledge that the Scottish man in the previous memory is the brother of Abigail, who is the lover of the captain, and we can begin to piece together the complex narrative. So we, you might remember we mentioned at the beginning that you have a roster of everyone on the ship, so we can look at the roster and evaluate the evidence.
The Return of Obra Dinn is a compelling game, and it's just a real snapshot of it. But it is so compelling, and we lost ourselves in it for 3 days.
Some of it slightly less than others.
Like Outer Wilds, its narrative is pieced together through a constant invitation into the environment. So those dioramas where you have to look and find the information, from which you gather resources and to solve the puzzle. The sense of reward given to you when you resolve the fates of the crew also keeps the difficulty in balance, so keeping that curiosity alive. The reward is a reminder to be confident in one's ability to solve the uncertainty. This keeps us curious, which is essential in driving our desire to pursue our initial invitation to explore in the environment, and hence we cycle back through.
Yeah, because with curiosity, if you don't feel confident in your ability to overcome the uncertainty, it's not fun anymore. And so games are very good at balancing this, that if they want things to be more uncertain, then they equip you with the skills to be able to deal with that uncertainty, so you don't lose confidence. So this cycle not only keeps us playing, but heightens the experience and our sense of agency. The frozen dioramas in Obra Dinn are snapshots of history, moments of space and time that tell one piece of the story. The more of these moments you discover, the more of the patchwork of narrative woven together by uncertainty is uncovered. However, the particular chronology of events is only useful for helping you deduce in this game, this chronology of events, it's only useful to help you deduce the validity of the insurance claim, because as we mentioned at the beginning, you're an insurance investigator. And so at the very end of the game, you're reminded of this, and this is the real narrative, the one that the players piece together through the resources embedded in the environment, the narrative of how you solve the puzzle.
So I guess looking at Obra Dinn, we can see that ensuring the player has some easy wins to begin with, and the build-up of skill is important to the management of uncertainty gaps. Uncertainty is not fun if the player does not have the confidence in their ability, something that we've already said, right? When the information gap experienced is at the optimal level of challenge to be surmounted by exploration or discovery, then the player will likely experience flow. This overcoming the uncertainty is empowering, which leads us onto our final case study, demonstrating how games allow the players to feel empowered through the environment.
So our final case study is Night in the Woods. In 2017, game designer Alex, I can't say his last name.
Yeah, I can always, Holoka?
Yeah. Produced and released Night in the Woods, which is a side-scrolling, single-player, narrative-driven adventure game. It was animated by Scott Benson, written by Bethany Hockenberry, and published by Finji. The game provides a meaningful commentary on the generational divide of millennials and their predecessors, as well as presenting one of the best discussions of mental health, in particular depression and anxiety within the games industry's recent history.
So the game follows the immediate events of May Borowski after she drops out of college and returns home to her school friends and her family. Through rich dialogue and well-developed characters, Night in the Woods boldly comments on life for one who might find themselves lost in a world they struggle to identify with. It does this with subtlety and sensitivity, relying on the environment to help tell this story.
As you play through the game, you quickly become familiar with Possum Springs, the sleepy town within which Night in the Woods takes place. Referencing Rust Belt America, Possum Springs is dying. Empty buildings, a lack of resources, characters with nowhere to be, tells the player the story of the town's degradation. And as in Outer Wilds, the player uses the environment to question and learn why they're playing, what has happened and where you're meant to be heading.
Also similar to Outer Wilds, Night in the Woods uses the mechanism of looping through the story. As May, you cycle through routine, going to bed each night and waking up each morning to essentially live the same day again. The time frame here is repetitive and familiar. It echoes much of our own experiences, which is surprising because May is a cat and her friends are a fox, a bear and an alligator, or maybe a crocodile. We haven't decided.
No. Yeah, one thing we were unable to discover in the game. The first thing you notice when you play the game is this fact that you're a cat. And initially you start looking for things within the environment that might explain this. At this point, our invitation to explore, question and learn from the environment is open. And examples of ways to engage with the built environment range from hidden rooftop dens to doorstep dwelling poets, where some of the characters become part of the environment.
However, through your explorations, you as the player very quickly acknowledge familiarities with your own experiences. There is graffiti on the walls, the high street is somewhat derelict, you see the same people on your daily walk, you chat with your mum every morning, your dad every evening, and every night before you go to bed, you log on and check your social media. With these real world routines established, curiosity about the game environment is gradually limited, except for the stuff that changes.
So ultimately, Night in the Woods very quickly forces us into a position where we're subconsciously, or maybe consciously, acting as one of the residents of Possum Springs, not questioning the routine and being very suspicious of any changes.
These changes are directly linked to the game narrative about mystery. In this particular game, the mystery gives us purpose. I guess that echoes in the other examples as well. It gives us action and agency, the power to change things so we might progress the game forwards, simultaneously progressing May forwards because it's her story. This is important because of the way the game limits curiosity about the built environment. It's very unusual in a game to do this. The purpose of a game is lost without that curiosity. So here, the mystery is essential to the player's experience.
So by the time you come to the end and solve the mystery, you become empowered. This then allows your curiosity in the built environment to return because your focus is now free. Night in the Woods takes this one step further to reinforce the point.
When you wake up the morning following the climactic events of the conclusion of the mystery, we won't spoil it, things are different. Some people who were regular features on the streets of Possum Springs are no longer around. This instantly makes us curious. Maybe this is because the routines feel like they have ended, or maybe something else. In any case, the world has changed because of your actions and you are allowed to return to the state of curiosity within the built environment. As a player, you look back and reflect on Possum Springs to question it. How has it changed? Why is it in this state? How will it change in the future? You know you have some power to change it because you have. So you return to the invitation to explore, be curious, question and learn from the built environment because you must find a new purpose.
So the thing to note here is the path to feeling empowered. Unlike Outer Wilds, the player's position in Night of the Woods makes the environment feel known, using routine to introduce the mundane and reduce uncertainty. Without uncertainty, our natural position of curiosity is compromised, and only once we're empowered can we return to being curious. When the environment is unknown, curiosity is easy. When it is known, curiosity is harder to achieve because there's less uncertainty in our playing experience. And I think we know this from our real lives and our personal experiences with the built environment, that especially at the moment when we're only able to go on walks in our local area, we're just not feeling curious about our environment.
Because everything is known.
Yeah.
So kind of this leads us, I guess, a bit to our conclusion.
Which is maybe it's a bit of an abrupt conclusion, I think.
Hopefully we're going to explain why in a sec. But all these games, to do a little bit of a summary, all these games outline 3 key points that make games special and valuable to other disciplines. The game environment is used to tell the story. Games start with the implicit invitation to be curious, or some games about the environment, and games empower us through gameplay. We want to go on and look at our next stages of the research and see how these aspects of game design in the design of the Urban Realm can kind of be implicated. So that's kind of where, I guess, where we're at.
Yeah. That there's lots more reading to do about narrative and how games use it, but now we need to look at how we translate these skills into the built environment. Games invite the player to explore and play, through which the player develops an understanding of things. Games like Outer Wilds and Night in the Woods use the built environment to give the player clues about their mission, their purpose, and the narrative of the world around them. As a vehicle of play where the engine that drives that experience is interactivity, these games are mostly differentiated by the player's ability to influence change in the world. And I think here is an important observation, that the major difference between games and the how we design built environments, or how we act in game environments compared to how we act in real world environments, is the autonomy and agency and action we have as players to make change and respond. That games really empower the player.
So there's a few, I guess, talking points that we're, I guess, looking into. We gave this talk to the games year 3, kind of a similar talk, the precursor to this, to year 3 kind of game students, and we were looking at how use particular architectural built environment case studies. But now we're kind of moving this on and looking at how communities are potentially evolved out of these things. One example being speedrunners in games, which kind of take these things and then take the curiosity mainly and their invitation into the environment.
Just quickly explain what speedrunners are.
Yeah, sorry. So for those unfamiliar, speedrunning is a kind of community within the games community that that focus or look into how that they can kind of break the game and get from when it starts to when it finishes as quickly as possible.
But the way they do this, they can't do it alone. So they play it alone, but they have to know every inch of that environment. And so they form a community of people that are learning lots of information about that environment. And so together as a community, they're like an extra level of curious about that environment, so that they can make their own rules in the game. So that's one area we're thinking of looking at.
So that's kind of the extreme of like being curious and being invited into the environment. Yeah. And we're starting to see potentially similarities with that, and in the real world environment with potential kind of the skateboard community and that culture. Yeah. How that kind of a space is that curiosity is taken to a certain level, and then that space is almost redefined. So we're at the very early stages of that, but that's kind of where we're going forward with this.
So thank you for listening.
But yeah, thanks for listening. Yeah, if questions would be great.
Well, let's open it to the floor, so to speak, if anyone has a question. There are some, might be a chat question, I think, or that a hand that's raised? I can't see. AD. Who's that? Is it Alex?
Yeah, it's me, Alex
Hi.
Dursley.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, no, it was really interesting. Thank you very much for the talk. It was funny because recently during lockdown, I helped my girlfriend write an essay on player agency in games and how there are certain things can sort of manipulate this sort of agency. And we looked into a study where it was players. They were split into two, where they had a narrative scenario and one was manipulated and one wasn't. And both groups reported back stating that they believed that they had full agency over the situation. For example, in a game like The Walking Dead, when you play it through once, there are a lot of false times where like a timed answer would make it seem as though it manipulated the storyline when it really didn't. It didn't actually like hold any function.
Yeah.
So, but it's how if you were to play it again, the linearity of the narrative would be like broken and the illusion of agency would be kind of like stolen away. But no, I just found that really bizarre because that was only a few weeks ago.
Were the games in that experiment that you referenced there, were they like narrative-driven games in the kind of like the Telltale games where you have to pick kind of from a selection of narrative options and you just go through the game that way?
Yes, yeah, that was one of the ones there, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think it's interesting because we're playing a lot of games because maybe that's one of the only exciting things we can do right now. So we've been playing a lot of games together, and we're finding that, and maybe this is by accident, just by the games that we're looking at, and the games that aren't like explicitly narrative sort of dialogue driven, maybe except for Firewatch, aren't as are more interesting and more engaging and more inviting into the story and into the narrative without all of this heavy kind of text and dialogue. So there's like really, really creative and very inspiring ways of telling a story in games that we're kind of really enjoying and trying to be inspired from. So it's interesting that you kind of bring that up about those kind of heavy dialogue kind of choice games.
Yeah, definitely. And I was just thinking also the impossible architecture that was present in the Stanley Parable games, and also Superliminal. That's a game I've also played, which is like messing around with perspective, and the reward in that game I found like very, very like rewarding to navigate through the levels and these puzzles. But yeah, no, brilliant.
They're both on our list to research. We're researching.
But yeah, if you like reward in those games, then definitely play Oberdin, because that's the most concentrated feeling of reward I've ever had in a game. So,
Will Jeffries has a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I've got a question, which is that I realised as you were describing these games that you could have games which are kind of politically very, how do I describe it? Like if you had a game about electoral fraud.
Yeah.
As a topical subject.
Where did you get that idea from?
Just arrived. I don't know where it came from. But if I've understood you correctly, I'm imagining there are games that do have a kind of conclusion and a narrative that's kind of set up. But with, let's say, a game about electoral fraud, there might be a whole series of scenarios that the game leads you through, or decisions, that means that the outcome might be quite surprising. So, and then I was going to ask, so I'm guessing that's right. It can be a kind of a linear conclusion that you arrive or research to, and you get to that point, or it's more open-ended. And then the question I had was, are there those kind of political games? Because you can imagine there's all sorts of scenarios that a game like that reinforces. So,
well, I thought Night in the Woods was really political, but not explicitly so, because it was trying to show what's happening to Rust Belt America and this generational gap. But you could quite easily play it without taking any of that on board, I think.
The maker of Obra Dinn, Lucas Pope, his
Papers, Please.
kind of precursor game, the
Yeah.
kind of one that put him on the map, is called Papers, Please. And it's a game about, you can see a theme of bureaucracy in these games, and it's a game about you play a border inspector and you are stamping passports, and you have to sift through different documents to let people in into the country or not. And it's set in this kind of sort of fictional communist state called Aristosia or something like that, and it's very, very, very politically driven, and the politics in it are not subtle, and that's the point of the game. And I think like he is a really good case study to see those sorts of things, to see those sorts of experience, because also his game design is excellent, because not only does it provide those narratives, but it really squeezes you into it, so you feel the pressure from all sides.
Okay, so my other question then is, have games been banned?
There's various games that have been banned for different reasons. I don't know of any sort of recently. More often than not, you'll get them banned in different countries. So like the censorship in China and those sorts of things will be banned for certain things. You have a big area in games called localization, and I'm sure that's probably in other disciplines as well. But it will be an area where you are consulted by experts and change and adapt your game to fit different cultures, so you're not offending players around the world. So that sort of thing kind of happens, but recent examples I can't think.
Probably because they go to long lengths now to try and avoid being banned in various countries, so they can make more money.
I wouldn't be surprised if Papers, Please was banned in various places, actually.
Okay.
I'll send you the trailer for that, because it's what was it, a bureaucratic dystopian
thriller.
Okay, sounds good.
Document thriller. It was.
Yeah, document thriller.
Great, thank you.
Graham has a question.
Hello to you both. Thank you so
Hello.
much for that amazing kind of walk in the park of gaming. It was really, really cool. I love the way you broke down the narrative in the Obra Dinn game. It was really, really cool. I love the kind of the graphic awareness and the sensibility of that game. The way you can see there's some sort of background in like the graphic novel genre have been brought into the game, but in a 3D sense. I'm not a gamer myself, but the way it's been done is just, it looks really beautiful. The two little clips you showed were really great. Was that type or style of the game, was that well received when it came out a few years back?
I think so.
For him, that graphic style was the starting point for him, which was really surprising because the game mechanics are so good and the narrative's so good. You would have thought that he'd have started with those, but he started with the graphic style in that case. And I don't think his other games he started with the graphic style. Yes. But he wanted to recreate the 1-bit style of the games that
Macintosh. Games. So I think that the most impressive thing I think is that the style always grabs everybody, and actually it's the most divisive thing. I think if people play it, they're kind of put off by that first, and then they don't persist. But which I think is bananas, because I think it's stunning. But the fact that it was started with the style and then the story is written in afterwards is crazy, because it's so good.
But as he built the ship, so he wanted that style. He started with the ship. He started building the ship, and then it's okay. What period is this ship from? Okay, what does that mean that ship looks like? How many people need to crew this ship? And so then you start building the story out that way. So he was really carefully pieced everything together, rather than, so he started with style but quickly shoved style to one side.
Because he achieved it so quickly. He was like, this is what I want to do, did it, and he was like, okay, well,
and
now I've got to make a story.
It's revealing all sorts of things to me about what this ship is, and so then as he starts thinking, okay, there's like 100 and how many people? 200 people running this ship. Then the hierarchies of the ship start to become apparent. So then you can work those hierarchies into this into the story, and as you play in the story, you begin to learn about the politics of how a space like that would be run. But then there's also limitations because of the mechanics. So he knew how many people needed to run that ship, but mechanically you wouldn't be able to solve that many uncertain deaths.
Yes.
So then you reduce the number to a number that would be feasible to solve.
Now, was that game addictive from the get-go, or does it take a few hours to really get addicted with the game, like any of the TV series that are out at the moment?
Addicted from the get-go.
Really?
Yeah, because of that, what we were talking about that balance of the difficulty, the way those clips we showed you from the beginning, and you get a kind of a very linear series of clips. Yes. And the game is broken down into 10 chapters, and you start getting various clips and different chapters in a really non-linear way, apart from those, really. But you quite easily guess the first 3 characters, which is the captain, Abigail, and then the first mate from what we kind of showed in the lecture. And when you get given those, you then get that experience of the reward, and then you're in. And so the game practically gives that to you.
Yeah.
And from that moment on, it's like,
I mean, one of the clever bits in terms of empowerment is that you have to, you can't guess one character at a time. So you have to have 3 answers before it tells you that you're right. So you can't just randomly guess.
Yeah, you can't just brute force your way through it.
Which wouldn't be empowering to play that game that way, because you don't have any confidence in your skills to overcome the uncertainty gaps.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you.
We have a question from Luke.
Yeah, hi. Just as a comment, like some more lectures like this from different disciplines would be like really interesting, because I think it's helpful that we get introduced to like different topics. So yeah.
Oh, good.
I'll talk about games. I'll talk about games all day, every day. So if you want more, that'd be absolutely great.
Yeah.
Anyone else got a question to raise? Holly, your hand came up.
Yeah, sorry, I clicked it on and off a few times. I didn't mean to. I just want to say thank you for the talk. I found it really interesting. I want to know what attracts you to research, as you said, those games. Are they ones that are recommended to you for their narrative, or is it kind of see what's popular at the moment, or how do you choose?
Yeah, so we gave a lecture at the very beginning of our research to the game students, and they recommended quite a few that they thought would be useful to us. But Jake plays a lot of games, and I have like quite a clear idea of the sort of things that I think would be relevant and interesting to the research. So we're just constantly talking about them, and then I kind of pick out the ones that I think are going to be fruitful.
And it's interesting though when you say that, because I do play a lot of games, but I never really, until the last few years, I've never really kind of had conversations about them. And I think for me, I have to have conversations with them outwards, and I find
know how we think, what you think.
What I'm thinking, and I find actually you every game you can have these conversations, because there might be bad examples for games. Like admittedly, I'm addicted to bad games as well, but like for certain reasons. I say bad from a storytelling point of view, really, to kind of contextualize.
I mean, okay, this is going to make it sound really nerdy, but there's a couple of other academics on the game course who wanted to be able to have these kind of conversations. So when we were allowed to meet in person, we'd go to the pub once a month, have picked a game to play that month, and then we'd like go have a book group and discuss it. And I really don't play very many games. This is all through this research, but those conversations are so great. The kind of close text analysis of the game. So I would really recommend doing that for like anything. Yeah. So an architecture reading group.
But maybe just a quick practical way of answering that question is, often you'll see on like things like Steam, which is sort of like the online game like shop or library. Lots of people play these kind of these are like loads of indie games. These indie games, sorry, we're looking at, which are independently made. And then there's like, if you like this, then you like this. So you kind of follow those routes. And we did a little bit of that too to try and find some of these games. And yeah, so that's a kind of a practical way of finding them if you're interested.
And there's a lot of academic literature as well that recommend ones.
Will, you got another question? Will, you got another question? Yeah.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Just bringing it back to architecture for a moment. So is there, obviously what's interesting about the games is that there's a sort of educational kind of angle and exploration that happens with the project. So is there a way in which there could be an architectural project or game? Also, I'm thinking of things like Minecraft, which are kind of very kind of more kind of generic. But I'm imagining a weird game that might be how to get planning consent in a London borough.
Yeah. I would play that one.
I think that would be an interesting.
Do that. That's quite a weird world to step into, and hilarious at the same time. So I think there's lots of rich veins for how the idea of gaming could be applied to architecture.
The main thing for us is this element of curiosity, and that if you could take how to get planning permission in a London borough and make people curious about it, because there's lots of things to be curious about, I think that would be a really good thing to do. But we're so familiar with our built environments, we just don't think to read them or be curious about them unless you're an architect.
Our kind of exploration has come from kind of our research in Great Yarmouth, and how that we think there are certain narratives in there that reflect the few rather than the many. And we started these questions of kind of like, well, how might you kind of represent this in the game, or we started tying this together from that perspective architecturally. And we are in the middle of writing stories for an analog game, and then to turn that, use that as a prototype into a digital game. So we are kind of, we've kind of thought about it, started it architecturally, we've jumped ship to games, and now we're trying to come back the other way to see how really tie them together. So
okay, sounds cool. Thank you.
We got a question from Catherine. Catherine?
Kind of made me think of this gameplay called Jazz Punk, where it's like where you're like this really bad spy and you're put into these scenarios. And I think in one of the scenes you have to like scale this building and infiltrate and go through all these rooms. And I thought that was like I don't know why that flashed in my head, but I thought it was a really cool game. So yeah, I just thought I'd add that comment.
Yeah, I haven't played that game, but I've heard about it. Dean's played that game and he loves it.
Okay, we'll have to have a look at it.
Add that to the list.
Yeah.
Alex, you got your hand up. Are you got another question or something?
Yeah, no, I just talking about that curiosity. I remember experiencing it firsthand with games like Journey for the PlayStation, and I remember in Halo when they had the Forerunner structures. They're never explicitly mentioned within the game, these Forerunner species that have been on these worlds before us, but they were present everywhere. And I remember from a young age going out of my way to find out, like, you know, why did they build like that? You know, who did they worship, and why would, like, the reasoning behind all these things in lore that was outside of the game. The
really interesting thing about Halo is I think it's a very, very, very early example of how they actually they invite you into the game to learn these things. And we haven't, I don't know if we've talked about this, but there are kind of nodes or computers you can go to and find certain bits of information, and they unlock kind of gameplay mechanics for you later on, but they're also part of the lore. And now we see loads of games that do this, where they kind of hide really, really interesting parts of the story in objects, in the environment. So it's kind of playing with this idea of this invitation into the environment, into that kind of built space that the game world is. And Halo's a very good example for that. It was one of the first, I think, from my limited kind of research into that area. But yeah.
Graham has a question. Graham or Chantal?
I think Graham's just had his hand up for a while. So.
Right, Chantal?
Hiya. So you were talking about how the kind of narrative behind games can sort of influence the way that we see architecture in the built environment. So I was just curious about how, like, what you sort of expect to see from this research. Is it the idea of lots of people seeing the environment differently, or of how architects plan differently?
So yeah, very good question. Kind of both, because well, it's as Jake said, it started from the Great Yarmouth project that we're doing, and as we were looking at the history of Great Yarmouth with you guys in third year, you could see that if you start to be curious about the environment, there's only sort of a small handful of people involved in designing that space. So the initial starting point was like, well, how can we get more people to be curious about their built environment so they can see this narrowness of influence in how it's designed, and then when they see it, maybe they'll want to be more engaged in influencing what it looks like. So that's the one sort of, that's the curiosity and empowerment that comes from games that we're looking at. But then the other side is everyone who's working in the built environment at the moment, so planners and architects and engineers and landscape architects and the whole kind of gamut of people, we should be constantly looking at how we can bring more stories into the built environment and represent a much wider, represent everyone who lives in the built environment in our buildings and our urban spaces. So both.
I guess, yeah, it's a really good question. I think we're at that stage where we're making these observations and asking those questions. And maybe that was a really good answer. I would have just said, well, it's up to you guys. I'm going to just put the responsibility on you. But yeah, I think I think it is both of them. But we're at that's what stage we're at, is asking those questions with this kind of research and with these perspectives. So yeah.
Yeah, asking which of those is feasible to expect from people, I guess.
I have two questions. The first one is that the gaming culture is a particular culture and a slice of society. What it is, who it is, we can all try to identify, but it's certainly not all of society, whereas the built environment, one must admit, is all of society, particularly if you're talking about a city, and a very large city. So the question is, how does this sort of work transpose, and to what extent is it transposable? The second question, I think, has got to do with the nature of repetition. In games, you can go back and you can play a game. You can play a game until you're tired of it. In a city, there's often a kind of issue with repetition and routine. And if you have routine, sometimes repetition also makes it a bit distracting. And I don't know how many of you have this personal experience in a territory or a place where we have 4 seasons. And if you're driving through winter and then when it changes to spring and the trees start to grow and you're going home, and then it looks unfamiliar to you because you've been driving through the winter, for days, and you start to get unnerved because the repetition and the curiosity start to have a conflict. And yeah. It's not a positive curiosity; it's a kind of negative sort of unnerving. Am I home? Am I lost? That sort of feeling. So how do you negotiate these aspects of how these are real kind of phenomena in the city?
Yeah, with the last question, I think it's understanding more about curiosity. That some of the research suggests that we have a baseline tolerance to that, and then that baseline is adjusted by how confident you feel in your ability to overcome the uncertainty, how familiar you are with the area that it is that you're encountering the uncertainty. I've forgotten the other bits. So I guess where we're wanting to look at curiosity in the built environment, we need to also be making sure we balance that with the skills we're equipping people with to deal with the curiosity. And then with
the first one, I think that the way I'd respond to that or potentially answer that is, I think you're absolutely right. Like we've had a few conversations about how actually there's an inaccessibility to games as well that kind of makes that community even more closed off because of certain languages. But I think our research here is looking at storytelling from games. So trying to boil it right down and look at the specifics, the specific qualities within that storytelling, and then how that can then be translated, because I think
the techniques rather than the stories, because some of the stories are really, there's still a very toxic culture in games, and they're not great at being diverse, but they're getting more and more diverse, and they're really the storytelling techniques are good, and they reach a lot of people, but the same type of person, I guess. So it's looking at the techniques rather than the stories.
I have a third question before I throw it back to Chantel, who has a question. And it's my observation that in a lot of games that I watch my son play, and various games that I've seen people play, have got a very strange ethereal aspect to it, that, you know, in the nature of how cities are layered, we horizontalize the ground. Whereas the game, the level of horizontality is not normally there. It's always this kind of hovering and almost, you know, navigating the roofscapes more often than you navigate the ground. And that is a really kind of interesting sort of aspect. But again, you know, it's my observation that there's a crowd of people who want to do that, and want to have a city that's terribly exciting. But then there are also people who just want to go and get milk from the corner shop and don't want to have any kind of, you know, curiosity or unnerving or you know, threat or, you know, excitement, because you don't necessarily want that.
Quite often in a lot of games the ground is dangerous.
So I'm interested in how you see that floating, you know, ground, that, you know, it's almost kind of made for people who are given to parkour or, you know, jumping over roofs or whatever, you know, and it seems to be de rigueur for all kinds of games that you're jumping over, and it's the way you navigate, and you know, almost actually I see very few games you navigate the ground.
With those games, I think it would be more sort of the player testing the space they're moving in to see how they can use it. So we take for granted with our ground how we use it, and because in the game environment, so one of those sort of platform games, you don't straight away know how you're meant to use the environment, and you test it. So the element that we'd want to take from that is that testing aspect. But yeah, someone should write a paper on ground in games, because it is really odd, the relationship with the ground. Like the developers have all had a really terrible experience with it.
There's a game out there called The Floor is Lava, and you're not even allowed to touch the ground.
So, exactly.
I mean, some people really have a dislike for the ground in the game developing world. So
yeah,
but we kind of like it.
Chantel has a question. Yeah. Chantel?
Sorry, I forgot to turn my mic on. Are you only exploring computer games, or are you exploring physical games as well?
Good question. So at the moment it's just computer games, but my background is in analog games, board games. So that's where the vast majority of my experience is. Maybe the first thing that comes to mind, the tricky thing about kind of analog space, is that you always have this omnipotent relationship with the space. Like you can see all of the space all at the same time in most board games, analog games. I guess the more interesting things to look at would be kind of games within spaces that kind of redefine those spaces. So like when you play like It or Tag or like hide and seek or those kind of playground games would be a little bit more interesting, I think, on the surface, without kind of digging too deep. But I think that's a good question.
It is, yeah. At the moment, the way we're using analog games, because Jake makes analog games, is a game designer. We're looking at them as a tool to communicate the research. So to kind of test ideas for the digital game in the analog game, because we can produce them a lot quicker. So a lot like making models when you're designing a building, you just quickly want to test some ideas and see if they're working. That we're using analog games in a similar sort of way.
I quite like your answer about hide and seek. Is one game that definitely does make you see your environment differently. So maybe, I don't know. I think that's quite an interesting answer.
It definitely, like those sorts of playground games are absolutely fantastic to look at because it's all about repurposing that space, right? Like you change the world with those games, like without sounding too dramatic. You rechange that space to serve your new purposes, and I think that's a really interesting process.
Will Jeffries?
Yeah, just coming back to your comments, Raymond, about the ground or the ground plane in games, and then to talk about my time at Squire & Partners. At Squire & Partners, there was a hard core of architects who were gamers, and I may get the name of the game that they were all playing wrong. I think was it Grand Theft Auto?
Yeah, there's such a game, yes.
They were obsessed with playing this game because they wanted to race around London, finding all the projects that they'd designed and built. See whether it had been updated in the various versions of the model. So they would religiously play that game, and every now and again they would get very excited because they could their project.
In that case, I feel like they really should have just gone into London and had a look.
They should have just raced each other in the real world.
But more real because it was in the game. It's kind of what I to say.
Yeah,
it is interesting, like to kind of like tack onto that, I guess, like real world mapping. I think it's a really interesting crossover with kind of our understanding of space within the real world and like the discipline of kind of architecture as well. Because I don't know if anybody's familiar with a game called Assassin's Creed. When Notre Dame burnt down or was had its accident with fire.
Had its accident with fire.
Had a fire accident by itself. Anyway, I'm rambling. Assassin's Creed had the Ubisoft, the developers, have a whole bank of the place mapped. So they had already mapped out for a game that was set in Paris. So they gave that information over to the council, who were able to then identify it or different kind of areas that they kind of observed and then use it in their redesign of it after the fire accident. So that sort of thing is really interesting, and there is a really live crossover.
Sure.
Jade has a question. Jade, are you there?
Say it?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I was just wondering, in terms of experience in the built environment, with virtual reality becoming more prominent, how do you think this will affect the way people experience it? As in, like, do you think this will aid the curiosity or maybe take away from it because it's becoming like too realistic?
I don't really like virtual reality because the real environment is really textured, and virtual reality doesn't have any texture. And so what it needs is good stories to help you imagine what that texture is. And so until virtual reality designers kind of catch up with the idea that they have to be able to tell really good stories in that space, I don't think it's going to be a good sort of proxy for the real world. But that's but I know a lot of people are very excited about the technology, so I'm just slightly texture obsessed.
Well, I think that's really important. I think that like one thing that gets really overlooked in video games is that level of texture, and when you're playing a kind of on a console, you get that kind of haptic like vibration that kind of it's a very small degree kind of invites you in, right? Like, and this is specifically just consoles because of the controllers, or but that is very important, and lots of games are kind of using that in different contexts. But in virtual reality, you don't get that feeling. You don't have the touch. You don't have many of those sensations. So as much as people use it, as Beck was saying, there is that disconnect. So you need to rely on stories, but the tech is so exciting that people don't rely on that. So I find that I don't really like VR that much because lots of people are wowed by it, but it doesn't go very far, I think, from an experience point of view.
So it'd be interesting to see how it's developed,
yeah,
and if they get better at using it.
Yeah,
I think. I mean, the research that we're doing, we're not looking at games spatially, because often they're quite like disappointing like
impossible, I think, as
well.
Yeah.
From an architecture perspective, so that's why we're really focused on the storytelling and how the storytelling creates these creates spaces and creates curiosity and creates empowerment
and creates a relationship with the space as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've come up to our time now. Let's thank our guests in the usual way. Thank you for a really, really enlightening talk. There were very many questions. I'm sure a lot of people would like to carry on and ask questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone. Thanks for having us.